Hello, welcome to the Talking Michigan Transportation Podcast. I'm Jeff Cranston. There's a lot going on in Congress right now with discussions about another reauthorization act. That means a bill to fund transportation, hopefully for a good number of years, so that the people who depend on these funds can make long-term decisions and have some certainty about what they're doing, which is what everybody talks about. I was happy to invite back to the podcast Susan Howard, who is the Director of Policy and Government Affairs for the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials, or AASHTO, and she shared her thoughts on the discussions and the chances that we'll actually get a reauthorization sooner in the cycle than we have in the past, and what she's hearing from members that she talks to on the Hill, and pretty much everything else related to federal transportation funding and policy. So I hope you enjoy the conversation. Susan Howard of AASHTO, I explained her background in the introduction. Susan, thank you for taking time to be here and talk about everything that's going on in DC right now as we push for transportation funding.
Of course. Thanks for the invitation.
So let's start with where we're at with reauthorization and maybe just break that down for the uninitiated, since everybody just kind of refers to reauthorization now, like we should all know what that means.
Right. So the last reauthorization bill, which was a lot more than just reauthorization of surface transportation programs, but that was its core, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, will expire on September 30th of 2026. Because of the unique way that transportation is funded at the federal level, you have to have a reauthorization bill on time. A lot of other federal programs can kind of go year to year with appropriations and be fine without authorizing legislation. But because we are dependent upon the federal gas tax to support the Highway Trust Fund, we really need either a bill or an extension by September 30th of 2026. What's happening right now, the House and Senate committees are gearing up. They have expressed a desire for a very aggressive timeline. They would like to have legislation drafted and moved through their committees by the end of the calendar year. So that would be unusual. I mean, that would be a good maybe 9 months to a year before the bill actually expires. And there's a few reasons for that sense of urgency, I think, that I can get into. But right now we're at a point where the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has solicited input from stakeholders. The deadline for that was last week. The Senate is doing a similar process. Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, I should say. There's a lot of jurisdictional things going on in the Senate with surface transportation, but the primary committee that drives the process is the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. They're doing a member request, meaning for members of the Senate. So by May 23rd is the deadline for senators themselves to submit their own priorities for surface transportation reauthorization.
So do you feel, based on what you're hearing in the mood, somewhat confident that given there's separate discussions about the broader budget and continuing resolutions and those negotiations, having both transportation and infrastructure and EPW get somewhere on this is a possibility?
I think they're certainly going to try. I do think it's a possibility. They could hit a point, Jeff, where they just can't go any further. I think the big issue is going to be floor time in the Senate, and then competing priorities next calendar year with tax cut expirations and a lot of other issues when it comes to the rest of the federal budget piece. So they're definitely going to make an effort, and I think they could get potentially pretty far, particularly in committee. And then it becomes sort of a leadership discussion. When can this come to the floor? Do we have the votes? They certainly would have the votes to pass something in the House, but the Senate's a little trickier because of the 60 vote threshold. So whatever reauthorization legislation emerges from the Senate committees of jurisdiction will have to have enough Democratic support to get passed in the Senate.
What do you think about, or what are you hearing, I guess, in terms of feedback on the Secretary's proposal discussion about some kind of, national registration to try to target alternative fuel vehicles, I should say?
As you're aware, most states have some sort of registration fee for electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. It ranges in its amount, from $100 to I think the largest one is around $350 a year. This discussion about possibly having a national fee has emerged in the last few months. It's really most prominently been discussed by the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee as part of their budget reconciliation package last week. House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee did include a national fee for both electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. It's really an attempt, I think, to look at ways to make up some of the challenges that we have with the Highway Trust Fund based on that user pay principle. So for folks who drive gasoline-powered vehicle, you pay the gas tax when you fill up your tank, and it goes into the Highway Trust Fund. These states that have enacted state EV or hybrid fees have been going under the philosophy of, despite what type of fuel or energy your car uses, you use the roads. The roads themselves, need to be maintained. And so we need to levy some kind of fee for those vehicles to capture some of that revenue. And so it's not a surprise that folks are looking at this at the national level too. We'll see what happens with what was included in budget reconciliation if it sticks, but I kind of see it as perhaps a look forward about what other mechanisms for funding Congress might look at for the next bill.
Yeah, it's a good conversation starter. That's for sure. I think, and Michigan, by the way, is one of those states back in 2015 as part of a road funding package, added a surcharge on EVs and hybrids for registration. And much to the surprise of people who still think that they're not paying their fair share, some studies from the Department of Treasury have showed that those surcharges do make up for the gap in fuel taxes. So, but what I'm curious about is how, on one hand, they're pulling the plug, so to speak, on National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program and other things to incentivize a charging network, which would obviously support more electric vehicles. It seems like pretty low-hanging fruit or small ball to think that doing this is going to really move the needle on these big funding needs.
Yes, it is. I mean, it won't. I don't believe it'll move the needle. There's electric vehicles are still a pretty small percentage of the overall fleet in the United States. It will grow. It'll probably grow whether or not we have a national electric vehicle infrastructure charging program. I think states will continue doing that work, even if there's not a federal formula program for them to utilize. So, but it will not solve the whole problem. It is more of I think, a principled, as I mentioned earlier, trying to get at that user pay principle where we're capturing some revenue from those users. But I agree. I mean, it's not going to be the thing that moves the needle to full highway trust insolvency. There simply aren't enough electric vehicles compared to gasoline fueled vehicles to make that transition.
So what else are you hearing about? We've heard that got some coverage when Secretary Duffy announced that. But what else are you hearing about administration priorities?
Not too much so far. I think they have really been focused a lot on air traffic control issues. A lot of aviation issues across the board. We've had the tragedy in Washington, D.C. at National Airport. We've had since then a few more close calls at my home airport at DCA, Ronald Reagan National Airport. So there was a big announcement today about the sort of plans for revising air traffic control. They have not yet articulated publicly what they're thinking on reauthorization. There may be conversations going on behind the scenes. They may be talking to the Senate and the House, committee leadership, but it's a little hard to tell at this point.
Yeah, speaking of air traffic control, if you get a chance, listen to the New York Times The Daily podcast that posted early this morning about what's going on in Newark, and it's pretty terrifying.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's understandably that's taking up a lot of oxygen, but we know that you're going to be still watching closely on the surface transportation aspect of this. Have you heard about U.S. DOT reorganization efforts? And, because we know Federal Highway lost 25% of its staff from the deferred payment reduction. Do you think there's going to be a look at rethinking everything at U.S. DOT?
That seems to be the rumor mill. that they're looking at reorganizing. I don't know any details on what that would look like. If it would be, you could approach it any number of different ways. I'm sure they're still sort of in the conversation period in terms of if you want to break down modal silos and have things more by function. So, for example, you have, and again, this is just an example, not anything that I've heard directly, but could you have an office of for NEPA or environmental project delivery issues that's not mode specific, right? So it all goes through the same kind of funnel or channel, regardless of the fact if it's a federal highway funded program or a FTA funded program. So I think there has been discussion about that. There are definitely going to be changes in the workforce because of how many folks have been taking the deferred retirement, early retirement. And I think that as a result, there may need to be some reorganizations to make sure that whatever functions federal USDOT holds on to will need to be, those functions won't go away. They could do a lot of deregulation. They could do a lot of passing things over to the states. That does take time. And in the meantime, we have a program that we have to run. So I think there will need to be some nimbleness there. And what we see down the road when it comes to, again, more being over of duties to the states or deregulation, we may see that down the road.
So it's interesting you mentioned NEPA because you're probably hearing what I am at the state and national level, and that's people asking questions about, the permitting process and expediting things, it really coming from both sides of the aisle. What do you think about that? Is there a real chance to kind of streamline some things?
I do. I think we've reached the point where the stars may be aligned for this. There was a Senate Environment and Public Works Committee hearing a couple months ago, maybe back in February, on this topic, and you would be amazed how similar the conversation was coming from both sides of the aisle. There is a commitment there to do something. Most of the environmental streamlining and permitting streamlining issues that Congress has dealt with in the past couple of years have been really heavily energy focused. It hasn't quite trickled down yet to transportation, but I think the surface transportation bill provides an opportunity, as well as all that's going on at the federal level with NEPA and changes that agencies are going to be making to their processes, as well as just general interest and support and prioritization in Congress. Again, it's a multi-jurisdictional issue. Again, it crosses over a lot of different committees, but the House Resources Committee, for instance, and we've started having conversations with them because this is kind of like a small piece of their pie in terms of the transportation part of it. But again, everyone's looking at kind of everything within their own jurisdiction to figure out how some improvements might be made to deliver projects on time and on budget.
Yeah. So do you think because there's some bipartisan agreement, we always say, transportation infrastructure, shouldn't be a partisan thing, but everything is these days. But do you see some common ground on transportation policy?
I would say in both sides of the aisle. I mean, both sides of the Congress. The House of Representatives, the T&I committee, the Transportation Infrastructure Committee, is really leaning on the success that they had with both the FAA authorization bill and the Water Resources Development Act, which were very, quote unquote, member-driven processes and very bipartisan. So the philosophy of Chairman Sam Graves is sort of, we get the member buy-in, and then it's a lot easier for everybody to vote yes. It doesn't have to become partisan. There will be policy differences in a lot of different areas. I'll be curious to see how those get negotiated in the House. And as I mentioned earlier in the Senate, has to even be more bipartisan or at least collaborative because of the fact that to stop debate and actually vote in the Senate, you need 60 votes. The margins are very, very slim in the Senate. So you're going to always have to count on having a broader tent to bring along those 7, 8 Democrats that you need to get anything passed. So you kind of have to look at it that way as how can we get buy-in from all of these different members and their individual perspectives.
Stay with us. We'll have more on the other side of this important message.
Even with the best planning, backups and traffic congestion can occur during road construction. This can pose hazardous situations for both motorists and construction workers, particularly when drivers are distracted. Motorists are more likely than workers to be killed or injured in work zone-related incidents. Additionally, the leading causes of all work zone-related crashes are distracted driving and speeding. So it's crucial to do your part in ensuring the safety of both drivers and focusing on your most important task, safe driving. Slow down and stay focused.
Talk a little bit about Chairman Graves. He's obviously a congressional veteran, seems to really want to get into and understand transportation policy. Can you talk a little bit about his background and what he brings to this?
Yeah, absolutely. Chairman Graves got a very rare exception to remain chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in this Congress, usually under the Republican caucus rules or Republican leadership. You have your term limited, so to speak, for committee leadership positions. But Chairman Graves made it the case, and it was met with positive, response that he was able to deliver these two big pieces of legislation last conference, the FAA authorization bill and the Water Resources Development Act, on time with bipartisan support. Again, that member-driven process. And he said, let me have a shot at reauthorization. And I think people have a lot of faith in him to be able to deliver it on time. So he's been very focused. He's held quite a few hearings across a lot of different areas over the last few months to kind of set the stage. Keep in mind too, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee is really large, and a lot of folks for whom this reauthorization bill will be their first. So a lot of this too is kind of laying the groundwork, educating members on some of these programs and what they mean to their districts. Just a couple weeks ago, there was a hearing with an AASHTO board member, Executive Director Carlos Braceras of Utah DOT, on the Highway Trust Fund. Again, trying to educate members on why this is important, how transportation funding works. And then just earlier this week, AASHTO President, Connecticut DOT Commissioner Garrett Euclid was a witness at a hearing on rail infrastructure. Because again, there was a very big rail title in the IIJA, and I think folks are wanting to ensure that it continues to be a part of the surface bill. It hasn't always been, but because of the robust funding in IIJA, I think people want to see that continue. So he's well positioned to be the one to shepherd this through. And I think that's part of the reason that he was granted this reprieve and an extension to continue as chair, because folks have seen how he can work to really deliver solid pieces of legislation.
Yeah, that's good to hear. I think, speaking of the trust fund and looking at ways to augment it, and certainly one of those things that they're talking about, as we mentioned earlier, with the some kind of registration fees at the national level, that could make a small dent. But are you hearing other ideas to augment this? And I don't know, tell me if you ever use this line with members when you're on the Hill, but what else costs the same now that it did in 1993?
Exactly. We have a really good chart that shows all of the inflationary increases of things from 1993, the cost of a movie ticket, the cost of health insurance, cost of college tuition. I graduated from high school in 1993, so things have changed quite a bit since then. One of the big discussions, so we had the discussion around a national registration fee for electric vehicles and hybrid vehicles. There's also a desire to look at a national registration fee for all vehicles. That got dropped from the reconciliation package that the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee was looking at last week. It did raise some eyebrows. It was probably perhaps maybe a little not ready for prime time yet, but I believe that Chairman Graves is still interested in exploring the idea. I mean, if you look, and what that would probably mean is some kind of phase out where we go away from the gas tax and we go on a flat fee, a per vehicle, just annual fee. So it's no longer tied to consumption of gasoline. It's not even a vehicle miles traveled fee. It is just a flat fee regardless of what type of vehicle. Again, as it's conceptualized now, that could change. Obviously, I think a lot of people would want to do some things there with vehicle size or weight or fuel efficiency to incentivize those, use those other kind of thinking of those other sort of policy levers. So we'll have to see how that shakes out. I mean, I don't think a gas tax increase is on the table. And BMT, I don't know. There was a little bit of progress made in the IIJA with studying road usage charge at the national level, but is not really come to anything yet formal that really seems like it's like, what's the next step for the next reauthorization bill? So we'll have to see how that goes.
Do you sense much of an appetite for that from members? Michigan has, in the governor's budget recommendation for fiscal year 26, a pilot, a road user charge pilot, and we've got a champion in our Senate Appropriations Transportation Committee who's really pushing for it to separately put it in their budget proposal. I get mixed reactions, obviously, from lawmakers here, but what do you hear on the Hill?
Still, I think a steep hill to climb. Still lots of concerns about the impact on rural drivers, issues with data, concerns about data security, all things that have been, tested and looked at the state level pilots. They've really served as laboratories and really gleaned a lot. We've been able to glean a lot of information from those state pilots. And now we have 4 operational programs in 4 states where it's a voluntary road usage charge, but you can opt into that option. So there's just been a lot more at the state level, and the needle has moved very, very slowly at the federal level in wanting to try anything nationally. So I am not sure. I think it gets mixed reviews. It's certainly known about, regarded as a logical, next step in terms of it is a user-based fee. It would be quote unquote fair in terms of you pay for what you use, that user pay principle. So, but again, it's just sort of been slow to take off and really have the federal piece kind of arms wrapped around.
Yeah, I think what I hear, and I'm sure you hear the same thing, is that progressives always have concerns about low-income people and how it would hit them, and there are ways to mitigate that, and some creative things. And interestingly enough, this is where some people on the left align, with libertarians and organizations like the Reason Foundation, who are really pushing this hard and have lobbied, for this at the state level in Michigan, and I'm sure every other state.
Yeah, it can be strange bedfellows sometimes, for sure. I think that, the concept is solid. And again, if you look at some of the things that have been tested at the state level, you can start to knock down some of those fears or concerns, but it still would be a big shift and a big change, in terms of administration, in terms of ease. And those are things I think that have so far been stumbling blocks, despite at the federal level, despite all the sound research and experience that states have demonstrated through their pilot programs.
Sound research and experience. Well said. Susan, thanks as always for the update. I wanted to do this ahead of the AASHTO spring meeting, where a lot of these things will be top of mind for people and will be discussed. So the timing's good. Is there anything else you want to add to the conversation?
I don't think so. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you, and appreciate it and love the podcast.
Thank you, Susan. I'd like to thank you once more for tuning in to Talking Michigan Transportation. You can find show notes and more on Apple Podcasts or Buzzsprout. I also want to acknowledge the talented people who help make this a reality each week, starting with Randy Debler, who skillfully edits the audio, Jesse Ball, who proofs the content, Courtney Bates, who posts the podcast to various platforms, and Jackie Salinas, who transcribes the audio to make it accessible to all.